The universe, Velsoren had always believed, was a book written in mathematics. Every civilization that had ever reached the stars had done so through the same door, the slow, grinding accumulation of knowledge, the patient stacking of one theorem upon another, and the careful construction of propulsion theory across centuries of incremental discovery. The Varric Dominion had taken 412 years to develop stable fold travel. The Chalundi Collective had taken 380. The Asane, who were the oldest spacefaring civilization currently represented in the Conclave of Paths, had taken 602 years and still spoke of those centuries with a reverence that bordered on religious. Progress, in other words, was not a surprise. Progress was on a schedule. Velsoren was a cartographer third rank, which meant she spent most of her working hours inside a pale blue sensory chamber aboard the survey vessel Meridian Cradle, pressing her perception tendrils into the soft interface membrane and reading the topology of space the way a musician reads notation, not as symbols, but as something already living inside the body before the mind catches up. She was Varric, which meant she had a long, segmented torso, 6 limbs that served interchangeably as arms or legs depending on what the task required, and a cluster of sensory nodes arranged around what other species sometimes mistakenly called her face. She had no face technically. She had a perception surface. The distinction mattered to her. What she was mapping today was a spiral arm that the Conclave designated Sector 017, the outer quiet as navigators called it. It was boring work. 017 had been surveyed twice before, once by Asane explorers nearly 800 years ago and once by a Chalundi research mission 40 years back. Both surveys had agreed on the same conclusion. The arm was resource-poor, strategically irrelevant, and contained only one star system showing any sign of complex atmospheric chemistry. That system, the Conclave catalog called it 017 Sol, had been noted as a candidate for primitive life and then promptly forgotten. Velsoren was here because the Meridian Cradle's primary mission route had brought her within efficient scanning range and because cartographer first rank Dunn believed in being thorough even when thoroughness seemed like a waste of membrane time. She pressed her tendrils into the interface and began the routine sweep. She almost missed it. The anomaly wasn't where it should have been. It wasn't in the data patterns that flagged biological complexity or in the electromagnetic spectrum readings that suggested technological activity. It was, of all places, in the fold space residue map, the passive sensor layer that recorded the ghost impressions of vessels that had used fold travel within the last 30 standard cycles. There were thousands of them. Velsoren pulled her tendrils out of the interface and then pushed them back in, because her first instinct was that the sensor layer had corrupted. It happened sometimes in the outer quiet, where cosmic background noise could smear data into false patterns. She ran a manual calibration. She ran it again. She pulled up the diagnostic records for the passive sensor array and read through them with the focused attention of someone who already suspects something is very wrong and is hoping to be proven right for the wrong reason. The sensors were fine. She looked at the fold space residue map again. Thousands of impression signatures. All originate from or terminate at 017 Sol. All in the last 30 cycles. She counted them more carefully. Her perception surface, which didn't do expressions, somehow arranged itself into something that anyone watching might have described as the physical posture of a person whose understanding of the world has just been quietly and completely dismantled. 4,311 fold travel signatures. From a system the Conclave had classified as pre-technological. She brought it to Dunn immediately, which meant she had to walk the length of the Meridian Cradle's central corridor and wait outside his thinking room for 11 minutes while he finished a perceptual meditation, which she normally respected but today found genuinely maddening. When he finally opened the door, a tall, older Varric whose perception surface had gone the dull amber color that indicated advanced age, she handed him her data pad without a word and watched his tendrils go still. "This is from the passive array," he said. "Calibrated it 3 times. 017 Sol." He said the catalog name as if he were saying something he had never had reason to say before. "The candidate system." "Yes." "Over 4,000 signatures. 4,311. And that's only 30 cycles of residue. The passive array doesn't retain data longer than that." Dunn was quiet for a long time. Outside the Meridian Cradle's observation ports, the outer quiet lived up to its name, a scattering of cold stars, the faint smear of a distant nebula, nothing that looked like the staging ground of anyone's civilization. "We should contact the Conclave," he said finally. "I already drafted the transmission. Don't send it yet." She looked at him. "I want to move closer first," he said. "I want to see it with direct range sensors before we tell anyone." That's a violation of survey protocol for candidate systems. Yes. He handed the data pad back to her. It is. They moved the meridian cradle to within 40 light minutes of null 17 Sol over the next 2 days, dropping into passive drift mode so that their own fold space signature would not be visible to anyone watching. Velsorin ran the direct range scans herself, because Abdun had asked her to and because she didn't trust anyone else to be quiet about what they found. What they found was this. The third planet of null 17 Sol, a world of blue oceans and green landmasses and white polar caps, a world so textbook in its habitability that early conclave survey protocols had a specific category for it called standard cradle configuration, was encircled by what appeared to be a significant orbital infrastructure. Stations. Shipyards. Defense arrays of a design she didn't recognize. The fourth planet showed signs of recent large-scale terraforming activity. The asteroid belt between the fourth and fifth planets had been partially mined. There was a structure on the largest moon of the fifth planet, a gas giant of cheerful reddish-orange, that her sensors could not classify. It was too large to be a habitat and too geometrically precise to be natural. It consumed energy at a rate that made Velsorin's calculation nodes briefly stutter. And the ships were everywhere. Not in a chaotic way. In a way that suggested deep familiarity with the space they occupied. The easy movement of creatures who had been living in their star system long enough that the gap between a planet's surface and its orbit had become, for them, roughly equivalent to the distance between one room and another. She watched a vessel the size of a small Varrock destroyer fold into existence near the third planet's largest orbital station, complete its docking approach in under 20 minutes, and fold out again with what appeared to be a full cargo exchange accomplished. The entire sequence took less time than her meditation cycle. They were fast. Not in the way that the Asane were fast, with their smooth, long-perfected fold mechanics and their elegant trajectory calculations. These vessels moved with a kind of impatient efficiency, as if the speed itself was the point, as if whoever was flying them had decided that the gap between wanting to be somewhere and being there should be as small as physics would permit. How long? Adun asked. He was standing behind her at the sensor station, his tendrils clasped behind his back in a gesture she associated with deep thinking. How long what? How long have they been spacefaring? Can you estimate from the infrastructure development? She looked at the data. She did the modeling. She ran it twice. Approximately 240 years, she said. Give or take 20. Adun didn't say anything. I know, Velsorin said. The Varrock took 412. I know. The fastest anyone has ever developed from first orbital flight to fold capable is 290 years. That's the Chalundi. And the Chalundi had the benefit of. I know, Velsorin said. I've done the same calculations you're doing. He was quiet again. Outside, one of the unknown ships made a fold jump so close to the planet's gravity well that her collision prediction algorithms threw up 3 separate warnings before she could silence them. They fold inside gravity wells, she said. That shouldn't be possible. And yet. Varrock's fold theory, every civilization's fold theory, holds that you need a minimum clear space buffer of at least. And yet, Adun said again softly. She sent the transmission to the conclave that night, while Adun slept and the meridian cradle drifted in its cold, careful silence. She sent it because protocol demanded it and because she had always believed that withholding important information from the people responsible for acting on it was a form of irresponsibility that she refused to practice. She also sent it because she was frightened, and when Velsorin was frightened, she acted. It was a personal characteristic she had identified in herself early in her career and had decided to treat as a design feature rather than a flaw. She wrote in the formal conclave reporting language. Survey notation, null 17 Sol, cycle 44 of mission meridian. The candidate system shows an active technological civilization at apparent stage 7 development or above. Fold capability confirmed. Orbital infrastructure confirmed. Estimated civilizational age since first orbit. 240 years plus or minus. Recommend immediate conclave review. Recommend against any contact until the review is complete. Request information. Conclave archives note this system as pre-technological. Requesting explanation of discrepancy. She sent it. Then she went back to the sensor station and watched the ships move through their star system like they owned it, which she supposed they did, and thought about what it meant that something had been growing here, in the outer quiet, in the supposedly empty corner of the galaxy, and nobody had noticed. Or a thought arrived that she pushed away immediately and then pulled back and examined. Somebody had noticed. Somebody had decided not to say anything. The conclave of paths kept its administrative center on a station called the Hearth Node, which orbited a binary star system in the interior of the galaxy's middle arm and had been built over the course of 900 years by the combined labor of 11 civilizations. It was, depending on who you asked, either the greatest achievement of interspecies cooperation in recorded history or a perpetual argument that had somehow been given structural supports and a ventilation system. Yasakem had worked in the Hearthnode's archive division for 31 years. She was Chalundi, which meant she was small, dense, and built for a high-gravity world, broad-shouldered and low to the ground, with 4 arms and a face that other species found either reassuring or slightly unsettling depending on their own cultural priors. She had a reputation in the archive division for being meticulous, patient, and deeply unwilling to let inconsistencies in the historical record sit unexamined. This reputation was why, when Velsorin's transmission arrived at the Hearth Node and got routed to the archive division's discrepancy desk, it landed on Yasakem's work surface. She read it 3 times. Then she went to the catalog. Null 17 Sol was there, exactly where it should be, a routine entry in the candidate system's database, last updated 40 years ago by the Chalundi Research Mission. Status: pre-technological, candidate for future observation, priority, low. Yasakem checked who had filed the original entry from the Chalundi mission. She checked who had updated it. She checked whether there had been any conclave vessels in Null 17 in the intervening 40 years. She checked whether there were any classified overlays on the system's catalog entry, restricted data, accessible only to senior conclave officials, that a standard archive search would not reveal. There were. The restricted data flag was small and carefully formatted to be easily overlooked. Yasakem would have missed it if she hadn't been specifically looking for something wrong. It was a filing category she had seen only twice in her 31 years in the archive division. Observation suspended, Cultural Emergence Protocol. She sat very still for a moment. Cultural Emergence Protocol was a conclave doctrine that was discussed in the abstract, in academic papers, in interspecies ethics, and in the kind of late-cycle philosophical conversations that happened when delegates from different civilizations had been stuck on the same station long enough to start genuinely talking to each other. It was the protocol that governed what happened when a civilization was developing fast enough that contact carried risks the conclave was not equipped to manage. It was, in theory, a framework for patience and care. In practice, Yasakem had always understood it as theoretical. Something that existed in principle but had never actually been invoked. She looked at the restricted flag again. Cultural Emergence Protocol, Null 17 Sol, invoked, Cycle 1847 of the Standard Reckoning. She checked the current cycle. It was Cycle 2089. The conclave had been watching Null 17 Sol under Cultural Emergence Protocol for 242 years. 242 years of silence. 242 years of classified files and no contact, and a catalog entry that quietly suggested nobody was home when, in fact, a civilization had been silently becoming something that could full jump inside a gravity well. Yasakem did something she had never done in 31 years of archive work. She flagged the file as an active discrepancy requiring immediate senior review, overriding the standard 40-cycle review timeline. Then she went to find Director Fray and tell him that the thing the conclave had been carefully not looking at for 2.5 centuries had just been discovered by a survey cartographer who had been doing nothing more dangerous than her job. Director Fray was a sane, which meant he was ancient and very patient and gave the impression of a creature for whom urgency was a concept he had theoretically encountered but never personally experienced. He was thin and pale, with long translucent fingers that seemed to be always in the middle of some gesture too subtle for other species to read. He listened to Yasakem's report without interrupting and then sat in silence for what felt like a very long time. "You've seen the Cultural Emergence Protocol file," he said. "Yes." "The fully restricted file or just the flag?" "Just the flag. I don't have clearance for the full file." "No." He folded his fingers together. "Hardly any people do. Director, the survey vessel Meridian Cradle is currently within 40 light minutes of Null 17 Sol. The cartographer has made direct-range observations. She has already transmitted to the conclave. This information is now in transit and will reach other archive nodes within." "Velsorin," he said. "Yes. I know her record. She's thorough. The discrepancy can't be managed quietly anymore. There is no direct observation on record. I'm aware. Then what happens now?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression that Hussein used when they were choosing between two kinds of honesty, the kind that simplified and the kind that complicated. "What happens now," he said, is that the Conclave Oversight Council meets in emergency session. And we explain to 12 different civilizations' representatives that the fairy tale they have been telling about Null 17 Sol is no longer something we can maintain. Yasakem was quiet. Fairy tale, she said. It's the colloquial term that emerged in certain conclave circles, he said. Over the last century or so, for the classified information about that system. What information? He looked at her for another long moment. The fully restricted file, archivist, documents the fact that Null 17 Sol's third planet, the one the inhabitants call Earth, was not simply developing fast. It was developing in response to contact. Yasakem felt something shift in her understanding. Contact, she said. From whom? From a species, Pradsum said, that the Conclave officially classified as extinct approximately 600 years ago. The species had no surviving name that anyone could translate with confidence. The Conclave's restricted archives referred to them as the predecessors, which was a term that had been chosen for its deliberate vagueness. The Asane, in their own historical records that went back far enough to include the period when the predecessors had still been active, called them something that translated roughly as the architects of arrival, which was more poetic but also, Yasakem was beginning to understand, more accurate. She got the clearance upgrade from Pradsum within 2 hours, which suggested he had been expecting to give it to someone someday and had prepared the authorization in advance. She spent the next 6 hours reading. What she learned. The predecessors had been, by any measurement the Conclave could apply, the most advanced civilization that had ever existed in the observable galaxy. Not the oldest. The Asane had records of civilizations older than the predecessors that had risen and faded like slow tides. But it is the most advanced, in the specific sense of having penetrated deeper into the underlying structure of physical reality than anyone else. They had understood things about fold space that the Conclave's best theorists were still trying to reverse engineer from artifacts. They had built structures in the cores of gas giants that nobody had ever successfully explained. They had, at some point, apparently decided to leave. Not to die. Not to collapse. To leave, to cross some threshold of existence that the Conclave's archive had no record of and no category for. Before they went, they had done something. They had seeded. It was the best word the archive could find for it. The predecessors had visited a number of star systems. The archive identified 17 with certainty and suspected more, and made contact with young species. Not technological contact. Deeper. Genetic, architectural, and cognitive. The nature of the contact was not fully understood, partly because the predecessors had not left instruction manuals and partly because what they had done was strange enough that the Conclave scientists had spent 2 centuries arguing about whether the changes they could detect were intentional or coincidental. For most of the 17 systems, the contact had resulted in modest, intriguing, but not dramatic acceleration of development. Civilizations that had grown a bit faster than the models predicted. Species with cognitive architectures that showed unusual adaptability. Nothing that demanded a crisis meeting of the Conclave. For Null 17 Sol, the contact had resulted in something different. The archive's scientific assessment, cautious, heavily qualified, and clearly written by people who were uncomfortable with what they were writing, described the inhabitants of Earth as having received what it called a deep structural cognitive gift. Not intelligence exactly. Not technology. Something more like a relationship with a problem that was different from any other species in the Conclave. A way of encountering an obstacle that was, at the fundamental level of cognition, unusual. Other species, when they hit a wall, built a door. Humans, this was the name the archive used, it was apparently what they called themselves. When they hit a wall, questioned whether the wall was a wall, whether it needed to be solid, whether the concept of walls was the right framework, and then occasionally walked through it while everyone else was still debating door placement. The archive's author had clearly been trying very hard not to make this sound mystical and had not entirely succeeded. What was clear, empirically, was that the predecessors had visited Earth approximately 40,000 years ago, well before the Conclave existed, well before most current spacefaring civilizations had achieved complex language, and the long, gradual consequences of that visit had produced a species that had gone from pre-industrial to fold-capable in a time frame that the Conclave's development models described, technically, as impossible. The Cultural Emergence Protocol was activated when an Asane Deep Survey mission found the first signs of industrial combustion chemistry in Earth's atmosphere, which indicated the start of rapid technological growth, and the Conclave scientists who looked at the data understood, based on old records, what was probably on the way. The protocol's invocation had been a decision to not interfere. To watch. To wait and see what emerged. The file contained 240 years of observation records. Yasakem read the summary pages and felt a continuous, creeping unease that she identified, eventually, as the feeling of being very small next to something ancient. The last entry in the observation summary was dated approximately 12 years ago and read, "Development pace has exceeded upper bound modeling projections for the fourth consecutive cycle. Recommend convening the Conclave Contact Commission within the next 20 cycles." Apparently nobody had done that. And now a survey cartographer in the outer quiet had made the question moot. Velsoren's second transmission arrived at the hearth node while Yasakem was still reading. It was shorter than the first. It said, "Updated survey notation, null 17 Sol. We have been detected." And then, after a pause that the transmission timestamp showed as 40 minutes, "They sent us a greeting. I am attaching the message. Please advise the response protocol. We have not responded." The attached message, when Yasakem pulled it up, was a short audio and visual file. She opened the visual first, a simple geometric pattern, a spiral, precise and mathematically defined, the kind of shape that communicated, "We know you are watching and we know you know we know," with a clarity that needed no translation. Then she opened the audio. A voice. She had read that humans communicated through pressure waves in the atmosphere, spoken language, and that they used it as their primary expressive medium. She had never heard one speak before. The universal translation matrix, which all conclave vessels carried, had flagged the audio and produced a text transcript. The voice was, according to the matrix's notes, calm, measured, warm in a way that the matrix admitted was difficult to quantify but had nevertheless attempted. The transcript read, "Hello. We've known someone was out there for a little while now. We kept hoping you'd introduce yourselves, but we understand if that's complicated. My name is Mara Chin. I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of people who have a lot of questions, and we figure you probably do too. We'd like to talk if you're willing. No rush. We're not going anywhere." Yasakem read the transcript 3 times. No rush, she thought. 240 years of the conclave watching in careful silence, and the first thing a human said was no rush. She went to find Pradsam again. Mara Chen was 39 years old, which was young for the position she held and old for the amount of sleep she'd been getting lately. Her official title was Director of External Relations, Unified Earth Governance, a title so large and abstract that most people who had it spent their careers waiting for it to mean something. Mara had been waiting 11 years, ever since she'd been appointed at 28 by a governance council that had chosen her not for her diplomatic experience, limited, or her political connections, non-existent, but for a quality that the committee had struggled to name in the official documentation and had eventually described as comfort with the unprecedented. She had spent 11 years building a department whose entire purpose was to prepare for contact with other civilizations, working from a body of knowledge that consisted entirely of inference, telescope data, and one very strange archive that had been found sealed inside a geological formation in southern Turkey in 2091, when Mara had been 4 years old. The archive, which the media had called the predecessor cache, though Mara's department had a more technical designation for it, was the reason Earth knew what it knew. It was the reason Earth had full drive 50 years before the theorists said it should be possible. It was the reason Mara's department existed. It was a set of records left by a species that was gone, addressed, in a manner that was more felt than literally read, to the species that would come after them in this particular star system. Mara had spent most of her career reading those records. Not all of them were decipherable. Many were not. But enough was that she had, over 11 years, constructed a working understanding of the shape of the galaxy's civilizational landscape that was, she suspected, more accurate than anyone outside her department realized. She had known someone was watching. The Fold Space Passive Detection Systems Earth had deployed across a wide volume of Sector Null 17, which had been designed for exactly this, not to detect approaching vessels aggressively, but to notice the quiet presence of observers who thought they were invisible. The Meridian Cradle had been in their awareness for 3 days before Mara authorized the greeting. The decision to greet them, and how to greet them, had been the subject of 17 hours of internal debate across her department and 2 emergency sessions of the Governance Council. There had been voices for silence. Voices for a formal diplomatic packet. Voices for simply broadcasting Earth's full contact readiness documentation and letting the observers read at their leisure. Mara had argued for something else. "We talk to them like people," she had said in the second emergency session, to a room full of individuals who ranged from cautiously supportive to actively alarmed. Not like a government. Not like a species. Like a person talking to another person who's standing outside the door and can't quite make themselves knock. That's not how interstellar diplomacy works, the Council's senior legal delegate had said. We don't know how interstellar diplomacy works, Mara had replied. We've never done it. Neither, as far as we can tell, has anyone done it with us. So I'd like to try starting with a voice. They had let her try. She had recorded the message herself in her office in the middle of the night, when the building was quiet and she could hear her own breathing. She had not used a script. She had thought about what it would feel like to be out there, in a ship, watching a world you'd classified as empty, and suddenly knowing that the world was watching back. She had thought about what she would want to hear if she were them. 3 days after the message was sent, a response arrived. It was text-only, in a language that the predecessor cache's linguistic framework helped Mara's translation team decode in approximately 6 hours, not effortlessly, but with the peculiar sensation of having been given a key that fit a lock they hadn't known they possessed. Another gift from the predecessors, she supposed. A structural grounding in the common linguistic architecture that seemed to underlie all sapient communication. The message read, to Mara Chin, Director of External Relations, Unified Earth Governance. My name is Velsoren. I am a cartographer of the 3rd rank aboard the survey vessel Meridian Cradle, Varric Dominion, Conclave of Paths. I should be clear that I do not speak for the Conclave or the Dominion in any official capacity. I am responding to your greeting because it seemed wrong not to. I have forwarded your message and our observations to the Conclave Hearth Node. I expect this will precipitate a formal contact process that I will have no further part in. I wanted to say before that formal process begins, that your message was heard by someone who was listening carefully, and that it was a good one. You asked the right questions. Versus. Mara read it in her office, alone, at 7 in the morning with a cup of cold coffee on her desk and the early light coming through the window at the particular angle that always made her feel, for reasons she'd never fully analyzed, like the world was trying to tell her something important. She read it 3 times. Then she typed a reply herself before her team arrived, before the formal protocols kicked in, before this became the thing it was going to become. The biggest event in human history, the subject of 10,000 future academic papers, the moment that would be discussed in school curricula for as long as schools existed. She typed, Velsoren, thank you for writing back. I think this is going to be complicated and I think it's fine. I'd like to keep talking if you're willing. Not officially. Just talking. I have the feeling we're both going to need someone to talk to. MC. The Conclave Oversight Council met in emergency session 14 cycles after Velsoren's first transmission, which translated in Earth time to approximately 40 days. Mara knew the timeline because Velsoren had informed her during what had by then become a steady exchange of messages between them. The messages had started personal, the kind of careful, curious communication between two people who are trying to understand each other across a vast and unknown cultural distance, and had gradually expanded to include the practical. What was happening on Velsoren's end, what the Conclave was deciding, and what Mara should expect. The council meets tomorrow, Velsoren had written 3 days before. I must warn you, the sessions are not quick. The Asane delegate alone requires 3 full days of preparatory documentation review before she will speak on any subject. The Varric Dominion's current delegate is someone I consider personally frustrating. The Chalundi have sent 2 delegates, which is irregular and suggests they are divided internally about how to approach this. The Karoth, who I haven't mentioned yet and who I should because they are relevant to your situation in ways I haven't explained yet, the Karoth have sent a military observer rather than a diplomatic delegate, which tells you what you need to know about their position. I'm writing this from a rest bay on the Hearth Node, where I've been asked to remain as a witness until the council completes its review. I've been here for 20 days. The food is nutritionally complete and flavorless in a way that I have come to experience as a kind of low-grade philosophical insult. How are you? Mara had smiled at that, the blunt gearshift at the end, the question dropped in without ceremony. She had written back. I'm fine. We're all watching the sky a lot. Not anxiously exactly. More like, the way you watch a door when you know someone's about to knock. I've been sleeping badly but working well, which seems like the right combination for this particular moment. Tell me about the Karoth. The answer had come back. The Karoth are the Conclave's largest military civilization. Not the oldest, not the most technologically sophisticated in other respects, but the most actively invested in military capacity and strategic positioning. They joined the Conclave 600 years ago under terms that were negotiated with significant difficulty. Their position in Conclave politics is complicated. They contribute substantially to the collective defense infrastructure, which makes them necessary. They have strategic interests that frequently conflict with the Conclave non-interference doctrine, which makes them difficult. They have been aware of Earth's development, through the Cultural Emergence Protocol observation records, for approximately the same amount of time as everyone else. Their view of your development, based on what I've been able to hear in informal council corridors, is not what I would call enthusiastic. Be careful, MC. The council wants to welcome you. The council also contains people who have complicated reasons to not want you welcomed. The emergency session began, and Mara's department received its first official communication from the Conclave of Paths 9 days later. It was a formal document. 47 pages of dense text that Mara's translation team spent 3 days working through. It covered the Conclave's history, structure, and membership criteria. It described the Cultural Emergence Protocol and why it had been invoked for Earth. It acknowledged the extended observation period with language so carefully qualified that Mara's legal analyst described it as an apology that has had all the sorry surgically removed. It proposed a formal contact commission and set out a timeline for what it called an integration assessment, a process by which Earth's potential membership in the conclave would be evaluated. Mara read the whole thing twice and then convened her department. Membership, said Olin Park, her deputy director, a tall man from Seoul who had a gift for finding the sharpest version of any question. They're framing this as a membership process. Yes. Which means they get to decide if we qualify. That's one way to read it. Is there another way? Mara thought about it. It means they need the framework more than we do. The membership framing, the assessment process, that's not for our benefit. That's so that they can manage their internal politics. 12 civilizations with 12 different positions on what Earth means. They need a procedure. The procedure protects them from having to make a single unified decision. So what do? We engage with the process, Mara said. Cooperatively, patiently, and with very clear eyes about what the process is actually for. Olin looked at her. And what is it actually for? It's for buying time, she said, while the Karoth figure out what they want to do. She sent the formal acceptance of the Contact Commission proposal that afternoon. It was written in the precise, careful language of official diplomacy and reviewed by 3 legal analysts and 2 linguists before she signed it. That evening she sent Velsoren a private message. We got the formal proposal. We accepted. I want to understand something. The document mentioned an integration assessment timeline of approximately 40 cycles. That's roughly 3.5 Earth years. Is that a normal timeline for conclave processes? Velsoren's reply came back fast, which by now Mara recognized as a sign that she'd been waiting for the question. No. Standard Contact Commission processes take between 2 and 5 cycles. 40 cycles is not normal. 40 cycles is a delay. HFY, from this point on, watch the timeline very carefully, MC. The delays will tell you more than the documents. Commander Drevolin of the Karoth expansion fleet was not, as a matter of personal philosophy, a patient individual. In the Karoth cultural framework, this was not considered a flaw. The Karoth had evolved on a world where patience was frequently fatal, where the gap between a decision and its execution could be measured in survival outcomes, and had carried this urgency with them into space in the same way they had carried their dense, heavily armored physiology. Not because it was convenient in a spacefaring context, but because it was theirs and they had not seen sufficient reason to put it down. He was a large being by conclave standards, broad and low-gravity built, covered in the overlapping chitinous plates that the Karoth had developed over millions of years on their high-gravity, high-radiation homeworld. He had 4 eyes arranged for near-panoramic vision and limbs that could be configured for 4-point movement or bipedal stance depending on tactical need. He was, in the assessment of every other species he had worked alongside, somewhat frightening in the same way that a very precisely aimed piece of engineering was frightening, not in its malice but in its singular purpose. He was reviewing the files for the Earth Contact Commission in his quarters aboard the Hearth node when his aide, a young Karoth officer named Subcommander Veth S., entered without knocking, which was how you knocked in Karoth culture. The council session closed, Veth S. said. The integration assessment timeline was approved. 40 cycles. Which delegation pushed hardest for 40? The Asane and the Chalundi coalition. The Varric Dominion abstained. Veth S. paused. There's something else. Say it. Intelligence from our monitoring of conclave internal communications, legal I should say, we accessed nothing restricted, indicates that the Earth delegation has been in private contact with the Meridian Cradle cartographer. Velsoren. The one who made the first contact. Drevolin considered this. How long? Since shortly after the initial greeting. Regularly. Daily in some periods. What are they discussing? The monitoring only captures metadata. We know the communications exist. Not the content. Drevolin moved to the observation port in his quarters, looking out at the binary stars of the Hearth node system. They burned with a yellow-white intensity that was different from his homeworld's sun, cooler, somehow less urgent. Velsorin has access to information about conclave politics that an Earth diplomat would find useful, he said. Yes, Commander. The Earth director, Chin, is building an intelligence picture. It appears so. He was quiet for a moment. SYMG, he said. The phrase was not Karoth originally, it had entered interspecies navigation language as a marker for a pivot point, a moment when the calculus changes. He used it in the original sense, from this point forward. From this point forward, VethAS, I want a full analysis of the Earth development records. Not the summary documents the Council received. The raw observation data. The Cultural Emergence Protocol records. All of them. I want to understand what we are actually dealing with. He turned from the window. Not what the integration assessment framework says we are dealing with. What we are actually dealing with. You don't trust the framework. The framework was designed to manage a conclave normal contact process. Earth is not a conclave normal situation. The other delegations seem comfortable with the normal process. The other delegations, Drevolin said with the precise flatness that Karoth used instead of contempt, have been comfortable with the Cultural Emergence Protocol for 240 years. They have grown accustomed to Earth being a managed uncertainty. They have not asked themselves seriously what happens when it stops being manageable. And what does happen? Drevolin looked back at the observation port. Out there, beyond the light of the two stars, in a spiral arm called Null 17, a civilization that advanced from using fire to full drive in the same time it took the Karoth to improve a generation of warships was sending official diplomatic messages in perfectly translated conclave administrative language. I don't know, he said. And that is the problem. The Karoth do not make strategic decisions about unknown factors by sitting in committee sessions for 40 cycles. What do we do instead? We go and look, he said. Personally. Velsorin found out that the Karoth commander planned to visit Earth space personally before the official conclave announcement because she had spent 40 days on the Hearth node carefully listening to the conversations in the diplomatic station, paying attention to patterns and unusual things, rather than looking for something specific. She sent Mara a message immediately. Urgent. A Karoth military commander named Drevolin has been authorized to conduct a personal assessment visit to Null 17 within the next 5 to 8 cycles. This procedure is irregular. The formal integration timeline doesn't allow for unilateral member state military visits. He's going through a loophole in the conclave charter that allows military commanders to enter non-member space for threat assessment purposes if they can demonstrate strategic relevance. He can demonstrate strategic relevance. Earth's development profile by Karoth strategic modeling absolutely qualifies as a potential threat. I don't know what he intends. The Karoth are not inherently hostile and Drevolin, by reputation, is disciplined and rational. But a Karoth military commander arriving in Earth space unannounced, without council oversight, is not a situation I'm comfortable with. What do you want me to do? I can push back through official channels, but I'm a third-rank cartographer, and this is a commander in the expansion fleet. My influence is limited. Tell me what you need. Versus. Mara read the message, read it again, and then did something she rarely did. She sat with it for an hour before responding. She thought about Drevolin. About what it meant to be a military commander in a civilization where patience was existentially dangerous. About the 40-cycle delay, that wasn't a timeline but a holding pattern. About the predecessor cache and the strange, deliberate gift that had been left inside a rock formation in Turkey 40,000 years ago, and whether the predecessors had genuinely known, what they were starting. About what Earth was actually, to a conclave that had watched it grow in the careful classified silence of 2.5 centuries. It was not, she understood, primarily a diplomatic question. It was a question about fear. Then she wrote back. Don't push back through official channels. Let him come. But tell me everything you know about him, personally. Not his record. I can read his record in the conclave documentation. Tell me what kind of person he is. I think I need to talk to him directly. MC. Commander Drevolin's vessel, the Karoth Certainty, arrived in Null 17 Sol Space 22 Earth days after Mara read Velsorin's warning. It arrived not stealthily, which she had half expected, but with a direct approach vector and a standard identification broadcast, the Karoth equivalent of showing ID at the door. Mara's department tracked its approach from the moment the fold exit signature registered on Earth's outer sensor net. The Karoth Certainty was a military vessel, long, heavily armored, and with the design language of a civilization that had decided utility was more honest than elegance. It was not, Earth's military analysts noted, a warship in the offensive sense. Its weapons profile suggested a ship built for deterrence and self-defense rather than aggression. This was noted in the briefings with the careful hedging of people who wanted to be correct but also understood that the distinction between deterrence and aggression in an unfamiliar strategic context was not a distinction you could rely on. Drevolin's formal notification to the conclave of his visit described it as a strategic assessment of potential threat vectors in Null 17 space. His communication to Earth's External Relations Department was more direct. A brief message requesting a meeting with Director Chen at her earliest convenience, in neutral space, a location between Earth orbit and the outer edge of the Sol system where neither party would need to yield positional ground. Mara agreed immediately. She traveled to the meeting on a vessel her department had been building for 11 years for exactly this purpose. A ship called the Aperture, designed for first contact scenarios, stripped of armament, and equipped with every environmental adaptation system her engineers had been able to model based on known and theorized alien physiology requirements. It was, in its own way, a monument to optimism. A ship built around the belief that a meeting was coming and should be prepared for. She had 3 days of travel to prepare. She spent most of it reading the personal assessment Velsorin had sent. Drevolin is not what you might expect from a Karoth military commander, Velsorin had written. He has a reputation in conclave diplomatic circles, which means gossip, which is sometimes better than formal records, for a quality the Varric would describe as perception depth. He sees further into situations than his position usually requires. He is not a warmonger. He is something potentially more complicated. A being who takes threats seriously and takes his responsibility to protect his civilization seriously, and who has the intelligence to recognize that some threats are not threats in the conventional sense and the psychological discomfort of not knowing what to do with that recognition. He is also, from what I can tell, genuinely curious about you. Not strategically curious. Actually curious. The distinction matters, I think. He asked about the greeting you sent. Specifically. He asked someone who had been present when it was discussed whether you had recorded it alone or with advisors, and he seemed to care about the answer. I don't know what that means. But I thought you should know. The meeting took place in a converted cargo bay aboard the Aperture, which Mara's team had spent the travel time transforming into a space that was, as best they could manage, neutral in every environmental sense. Temperature, lighting, and atmospheric composition calibrated to a midpoint that should be merely uncomfortable for both species rather than hazardous. There was a table because tables were, apparently, cross-culturally useful for meetings. There were 2 chairs designed for human bodies and 2 Karoth profile support frames that their best engineering had produced based on the physiology data in the predecessor cache. Drevolin arrived with 1 aide. Mara had brought Olin Park and a linguist named Ria Sandoval, who had spent 5 years developing real-time translation protocols for the Karoth language. Drevolin was larger than she had expected from the physical descriptions. Not menacing, she had prepared herself against reading menace into the unfamiliar, but genuinely large, like a being designed by evolution for a hard world. His 4 eyes tracked the room comprehensively when he entered, in a movement that her nervous system wanted to read as threat scanning but which she deliberately reframed as simply how he looked at the world. The environmental calibration was apparently adequate. He moved to the Karoth support frame without visible difficulty. They looked at each other across the table. The universal translation matrix handled the first exchange, which was procedural. Names, titles, and formal acknowledgement of the meeting's unofficial status within the conclave framework. The kind of words that established ground before the actual standing began. Then Drevolin said something that Ria's real-time translation rendered, after a brief pause, as, "You recorded the greeting alone." Mara looked at him. Yes. No script. No. He was quiet for a moment. His aide, Vethes, was watching this exchange with the alertness of someone who had learned to read their commander's silences. Why, he said. Mara considered the question. It was not what she had expected as an opening. She had prepared for threat assessments, strategic positioning, and territorial concerns about Earth's development pace. She had not prepared for why did you record it alone. Because, she said carefully, I thought the most important thing was that it sounded like a person talking, not an institution. Most diplomatic communications are better served by institutional voice. Yes. But I didn't know if diplomatic communication was what we needed. What did you think you needed? She looked at him across the table, at the 4 eyes tracking her with that comprehensive attention, at the strong, precise hands resting on the Karoth support frame, at the being who had come 20 light-years outside normal conclave channels to sit in a cargo bay and ask questions. "I thought we needed someone to actually hear us," she said. "And I thought the only way to make that happen actually was to speak." Drevholin was quiet for a long time. "I've read 240 years of cultural emergence protocol observation records," he said finally. "The complete archive. All of it. All of it." "Yes." He moved slightly in the support frame, not in discomfort, Rhea would note later, but the Karoth physical expression of shifting focus. "The files the conclave prepared for the Contact Commission are accurate. They are also incomplete in ways that I believe are significant." "Incomplete how?" "The files describe Earth's development as anomalously fast. They attribute this to what they call a cognitive gift from the predecessors. They model it as a quantitative difference, faster development of the same kinds of things." "And you think it's something else?" "I think," he said, "that what the predecessor gift actually changed was not the speed at which you develop things. I think it changed the direction of your development. And the conclave's models don't have a framework for that distinction. They are measuring the wrong variable." Mara felt something shift in the conversation, a quality of attention sharpening on both sides of the table. "Tell me what you mean," she said. Drevholin had spent 3 weeks aboard the Hearth node reviewing the raw observation data from 2.5 centuries of cultural emergence protocol monitoring. He possessed the deep analytical training of a military commander, whose survival in the Karoth operational context often hinged on accurate threat modeling, and he applied this training to the Earth files with the focused intensity of someone who suspected the existing analysis was missing something fundamental. What he found was not a threat. It was something that his threat assessment framework did not have a category for, which was in its own way more unsettling. The conclave models tracked Earth's development in terms of standard civilizational metrics: energy production, propulsion technology, computational capacity, and territorial reach. By these metrics, Earth was simply fast. Anomalously, historically unprecedentedly fast, but still on the same developmental trajectory as every other spacefaring civilization, just compressed into a shorter timeline. But Drevholin had noticed something in the raw data that the summaries glossed over. Every spacefaring civilization in the conclave, Varek, Chalundi, Asane, Karoth, and 8 others, had followed a recognizable pattern in its technological development. Breakthroughs happened in the wake of wars, resource crises, and existential threats. Innovation was driven by need. The shape of a civilization's technology, when viewed clearly, was the material manifestation of its fears. The Karoth had developed their armor-plating technology because of the radiation levels on their homeworld. The Varek had developed fold theory because their star was entering a late phase and they needed to leave. The Asane had developed their extraordinary longevity treatments because they were a species for whom death, in their early history, had been very near. Every civilization built what it was afraid of losing. Earth's technology told a different story. Not a linear story. Earth had had its wars, its crises, and its close calls with extinction-level threats from both within and without. However, fear did not drive the pattern of innovation in the same way. There were too many examples of development that served no immediate survival purpose, that addressed problems not yet pressing, that built solutions to situations that hadn't occurred yet. There was a quality of anticipatory invention, building for a future not yet visible, solving for needs not yet felt. And there was something else. Drevholin found something in the observation records from Earth's last 50 years, as the civilization moved into its advanced technological phase. They kept changing their minds about what the technology was for. Not in a chaotic way. It wasn't like a civilization that lacked direction. This suggested something more fundamental. For humans, technology was not the endpoint. It was the beginning of a question. Each thing they built became the frame through which they asked a different question, and this question produced a new direction that led somewhere the original development could not have predicted. It was, as Drevholin had realized late one night in his Hearthnode quarters, the technological equivalent of what Velsorin had observed in the greeting message. It wasn't faster. It wasn't more powerful. It was differently oriented. Aimed at something the Conclave's standard models didn't measure and couldn't predict. He explained this to Mara in the cargo bay of the Aperture as carefully as he could. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you think it's aimed at?" He looked at her. "That's the question I can't answer from the outside. That's why I came here." "You came here to ask us what we want." "Yes. Not what we're capable of. Not whether we're a threat. What we want." "Yes." Mara was quiet for another moment. "Most people," she said slowly, "who've been watching us, based on the conclave documentation I've read, seem to have framed the question as whether we're going to be a problem. Most people are asking a reasonable strategic question. I'm trying to ask a more important question. You're asking whether the predecessor gift was about making us dangerous or making us useful. No. Something shifted in his expression. The four eyes refocused, and Ria would spend an hour after the meeting trying to describe in her notes what exactly the expression communicated, eventually settling for correction without impatience. I'm asking whether the predecessor gift was about making you either of those things. Dangerous. Useful. These are observer frameworks. I want to know what framework you are using. Mara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, Caro, I need a moment. She turned to Olin, and they exchanged a few quiet words in English, below the translation threshold, and then she turned back. I'm going to tell you something, she said to Drevolin, that I haven't told the Conclave's formal commission. Not because I'm hiding it, but because I didn't think they had asked the right question to deserve the answer yet. And I have asked the right question? You're the first person I've talked to who seems to want to understand rather than to classify. She paused. We know about the predecessors, not just what they left us. We know, from the cache, something about what they intended. Drevolin was very still. The cache includes what we call the letters, Mara said. They're not precisely letters. They're more like compressed recordings of intention, left in a format that takes human neurology a specific amount of time to fully absorb. We've been absorbing them for 30 years. We don't have all of them yet. But we have enough. What do they say? They don't say things exactly. They show. They show the shape of what the predecessors were trying to solve before they left. What they were working on when they decided to go wherever they went. And they show us as part of that, not as a solution to the problem, as a thread in the continuing investigation. Investigation of what? Mara looked at the table for a moment and then at him. They were trying to figure out, she said carefully, how a universe that begins in physics ends in meaning. How the gap between what exists and what matters gets bridged. They thought it was the central problem. They thought every civilization in the galaxy was a different attempt at an answer. And they thought we might be a kind of answer they hadn't tried yet. The cargo bay was quiet. Bethias was very still. Drevolin said slowly, that is not in the Conclave's archive records of the predecessor cache. No. The Conclave is unaware of the letters. The cache findings that were shared with the Conclave, the technological and linguistic material, were made available because they were clearly tools, and we chose to be transparent about tools. The letters are not tools. What are they? We're still figuring that out. The Conclave Oversight Council received Drevolin's formal assessment report 30 cycles after his meeting with Mara Chen. The report was not what they had expected. Commander Drevolin was a military officer. His assessment reports typically dealt with force vectors, threat probabilities, and strategic buffer recommendations. They were documents that the Conclave's diplomatic corps sometimes found uncomfortable but could at least translate into their frameworks. This report was 61 pages. 12 of them covered standard military threat assessment, Earth's technological capacity, full drive capabilities, orbital infrastructure, and military assets. The assessment concluded with a strategic threat rating of moderate and declining. The remaining 49 pages were something the Conclave had no formal category for. Drevolin described his meeting with Director Chin in full. He described the framework question, what are you aimed at? And its answer. He described the letters and what Mara had told him they contained. He described, with the precise honesty of someone who had decided that accuracy mattered more than comfort, his assessment of what these words meant. His conclusion read, the conventional framework for assessing Earth as a potential strategic threat is valid. It is incomplete. Earth's development profile, when correctly understood, is better modeled as something other than military or territorial expansion. It is best modeled as a civilization pursuing a research program. The program is the continuation of a project begun by the predecessors. The project is not technological in the conventional sense. The project is philosophical and cosmological in nature. My assessment is that the question of whether Earth poses a threat to the Conclave is secondary to a different question. Whether the Conclave is capable of engaging with a civilization whose primary orientation is not territorial, not acquisitive, and not dominance-seeking, but is instead organized around an investigation we do not fully understand. I recommend that the integration assessment timeline be accelerated, not extended. 40 cycles is not caution. It is an admission that the Conclave does not know how to process what Earth is and is using time to avoid deciding. That is understandable, but it is not a strategy. I also recommend that the conclave request full access to the predecessor letters with Earth's consent. This process will be complicated. It will be worth it. The report landed in the council session like something dropped from a height. The Karoth delegation had expected their commander's report to give them strategic leverage, grounds for a harder line on Earth's integration, a military assessment that justified a slower, more controlled process. Instead, they received Drevolin's recommendation for faster integration, which, despite the military-precise language, conveyed something akin to admiration. The Asane delegate read the section about the letters 3 times and then asked for the session to be recessed for meditation. This was granted. The Chalundi delegates, there were still 2 of them, still internally divided, found themselves unexpectedly unified by the report, though unified in different directions. One argued that it proved Earth needed to be brought into the conclave immediately. The other argued that it proved Earth was too unpredictable to bring in at all. The Varek delegate sent an urgent private message to Velsorin asking for her personal assessment, which was irregular but which Velsorin, by this point, was used to providing. Yasakim read the report in the archive division and then sat at her work surface for a very long time thinking about what it meant that the thing she had grown up being told was a fairy tale. Earth, the fast civilization, the anomaly, the conclave's quiet open secret, was apparently not a tale at all but a question. The oldest question. I'm still being asked. She wrote a note in the margin of her archive file on Null 17 Sol. The file should be reclassified. Not as a candidate system, not as a cultural emergence protocol, not as an integration assessment. I don't know what the right category is. Please inquire again once we have a better understanding. Then, 14 days after Drevolin's report was submitted, someone fired on an Earth vessel. It was not a conclave member. It was not a military operation. It was a single vessel, armed, unregistered, of a hull design that Earth's naval database flagged as consistent with Karoth military surplus, which meant nothing on its own because Karoth surplus equipment was widespread across 100 independent operators across the galaxy. It intercepted a freight vessel called the Morning Survey at the edge of the Sol system, in the transfer lane between Earth and Mars, and fired 4 times. 3 of the 4 shots missed. The 4th damaged the Morning Survey's secondary propulsion array. The attacking vessel then fled into fold space before Earth's defense response could arrive. No one was killed. The Morning Survey entered port under emergency power. Earth's External Relations Department sent a formal inquiry to the conclave within 24 hours. The conclave's response was immediate, unified, and, in Mara's assessment, reading it with Velsorin's weeks of corridor intelligence as a lens, genuinely alarmed. Not performatively alarmed. Actually alarmed. 12 civilizations' diplomatic machinery suddenly moving at a speed that the 40-cycle integration timeline had not suggested was possible. Velsorin's private message arrived while Mara was still reading the formal conclave inquiry response. The attack is being debated everywhere on the Hearth node right now. The dominant consensus is that it was not sanctioned by any conclave member. The Karoth delegation is in emergency internal session. Drevolin's report has already created significant internal tension in their military command structure, and elements that did not appreciate his recommendation are now under suspicion of having acted unilaterally. The conclave is frightened. Not of the attack itself, it was small and apparently disorganized. They are frightened because the attack reveals something they had managed not to look at directly. There are actors in this galaxy, inside and outside the conclave structure, who have decided that Earth's existence at this level of development is a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be engaged. This attack will not be the last action. That is my assessment. I'm not a military analyst, but I am a cartographer, and I know what it looks like when a pattern has just started revealing itself. What are you going to do? Mara read the message. Read it again. Then she went to a very specific part of the Governance Council's classified infrastructure, a section that had been built over 11 years, carefully and quietly, alongside all the diplomatic and scientific preparation, and she authorized the release of a document that had been sitting in preparation since she was 32 years old. It was a communication to the Conclave Oversight Council. It was also, via simultaneous transmission, a communication to every fold space navigation beacon in the sector. It was not a threat. It was not a military ultimatum. It was an invitation. And it included, attached as a supplementary file, a partial translation of one of the predecessor letters. The partial translation of the predecessor letter was 14 pages in conclave administrative language and had been produced over 3 years by the best linguists and cognitive scientists Earth's External Relations Department had access to. It was partial because even 30 years of absorption and analysis had not made the full letter fully comprehensible. Not because the translation was imperfect but because some of what the letter contained required, apparently, a framework that humans were still building. The 14 accessible pages said this. We found, in our investigation, that the universe is structured around a tendency. Not a law, not a mechanism, but a tendency, the way a river tends toward the sea, which is not compulsion but direction. The tendency is toward complexity that reflects on itself. Matter becomes chemistry, chemistry becomes biology, biology becomes mind, and mind becomes something we do not have a word for yet because we have not finished becoming it. Every civilization is a different experiment in what this tendency produces. Every experiment is valid. Every experiment ends, eventually, in one of two ways. Either the civilization reaches the threshold and crosses it as we are crossing it, or the civilization stops short, held in place by fear of what the next question requires. The fear is understandable. Each step of the tendency requires giving something up, a certainty, a boundary, a definition of self that felt permanent. The universe does not ask permission for this. It only offers the door. We visited the worlds we visited because we wanted the investigation to continue after we were gone. We chose differently in each place because the same choice in different soils grows differently. In some places we left tools. In some places we left questions. In one place, the blue world in the outer quiet, we left something we had not tried before. We left the company. Not guidance. Not an advantage. The specific gift of not being entirely alone in asking the question. What grows from this we do not know. That is why we left it. The things we do not know are the only interesting things remaining. To whoever reads this, the investigation does not belong to any civilization. It does not belong to us. We are not its authors. We are only fellow travelers for a time. Continue. The reaction to the letter in the conclave session was, by Velsorin's account, the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed. It was not unanimous. Nothing in the conclave was unanimous. The Karoth delegation's response was complex. A visible internal division between those who found the letter destabilizing in a threatening way and those who found it destabilizing in a clarifying way, which were two completely unique things. The Asane delegate sat in silence for so long that 3 other delegates sent aides to check that she was conscious. She was apparently processing. But the overall effect was not what Mara had feared and not quite what she had hoped. It was something stranger. The quality of the conversation changed. Not the conclusions. Those were still contested, still fragmented across 12 civilizational frameworks, still subject to all the political friction that made the conclave both necessary and maddening. But the quality. People started asking different questions. Not what do we do about Earth, but what does Earth know that we need to understand? Not how do we manage this contact, but what does this contact mean for what we thought we were doing? Velsorin wrote to Mara. I've been on this station for 62 days now. I've watched conclave politics for most of my adult career in one form or another. I've never seen it move like this. The 40-cycle timeline is dead. The formal integration assessment is being restructured. There's an emergency proposal on the table from 7 of the 12 delegations to establish a joint conclave Earth Research Commission specifically for the predecessor letters. The Karoth situation is unresolved. Drevolin has been formally cleared of any connection to the attack. The investigation points to a faction within his military structure that acted without authorization. He has, in the last 2 days, requested a second meeting with you. NMC, the Asane delegate, asked me something today in the corridor when nobody else was around. She asked me what you were like. Personally. I didn't know quite what to say. I told her you recorded a message in the middle of the night, alone, without a script, because you thought the most important thing was that it sounded like a person talking. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, the predecessors always chose well. I thought you should know. Versus. The second meeting between Mara Chin and Commander Drevolin happened not in a cargo bay but on Earth. This had been Drevolin's request, specifically and without elaboration. Mara had brought it to the Governance Council as a question, and the Council had, after 2 hours of debate that she mostly spent watching and listening rather than participating, approved it. He arrived on the 3rd planet of Null 17 Sol for the first time in the early morning of an autumn day, at a small reception facility outside a city called Geneva, surrounded by the particular kind of light that comes from a single yellow-white star through a thin layer of cloud. He stepped out of the shuttle onto grass. He had requested no special landing surface, just the open ground, and stood for a moment with the 4 eyes taking in the sky, the air, and the way the light moved in the atmosphere. Vethes at his side said very quietly in Karoth, "Is it what you expected?" "No," Drevolin said. "It's smaller." Mara, standing a few meters away with Olin and Ria, watched him look at the sky. She had watched footage of Karoth military commanders receiving diplomatic arrivals. They moved differently here. Slower, she realized. Not cautious. Something else. It was like a being that had spent its life in controlled environments suddenly encountering space that was genuine rather than engineered. She walked toward him. He looked at her with the comprehensive four-point gaze that she had, which, over months of preparation and one previous meeting, she had stopped reading as threatening. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the ground," he said, which Rhea translated smoothly, though she caught a note in the Karoth that she rendered afterward as literally, the unmediated ground, the actual surface. He meant it precisely. He had wanted to stand on something real. They walked. She had designed the visit around movement rather than meetings. The formal discussions could happen in rooms. She wanted him to see the place. Not the impressive things. The ordinary things. They walked through the edges of the city, where the morning was starting and people were going about their days in the way that people do in cities everywhere, with the focused inattention of creatures for whom their environment is so familiar that they have stopped seeing it. She watched Drevolin watch them with the opposite quality, seeing everything. "There are many of them," he said at one point. "About 9 billion on this planet. Your census records in the observation files showed 8.3 billion 40 years ago. We grow fast," she said. "In various senses." He made a sound that Rhea translated as acknowledgement with implication, which was apparently a Karoth vocal form without an English equivalent but suggested that he understood she meant more than what she said. "The attack," he said. It wasn't a question. This was addressed in the formal conclave inquiry. "Yes. The faction that authorized it has been removed from operational command." He paused. "I removed them. I know. It was not difficult in the mechanical sense. It was the right action. The difficult part was that they were not wrong about the strategic concern. They were wrong about the response." Mara thought about the incident as they walked. Around them, the city was waking up. The sound of vehicles, of voices, of the specific collective noise of human beings going about the business of their days. "What was their concern?" she said. "You would grow faster than the conclave could adapt. By the time the conclave found a framework to engage with you, you would have already moved beyond any framework they could offer. And you think they were mistaken about the response. I think the correct response to something that moves faster than your framework is to change the framework." He paused. "Not to stop the thing." They walked in silence for a while. "The letter," he said. "Yes. Company," he said. "The predecessors left the company." He used the word carefully as if weighing it. "Not an alliance. Not a tool. Company. For the question. That's how we read it. The conclave," he said slowly, "has been a practical alliance for 900 years. Trade, mutual defense, shared infrastructure. In the main, arrangements have been made. Agreements between civilizations with compatible but not identical interests." He paused. "I have wondered for some years whether arrangements are sufficient. Whether a collection of compatible interests constitutes anything more than temporary proximity. You've been wondering what the point is. In the commander's sense. Yes. What is the conclave for? Not operationally. Fundamentally." Mara stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her. "The predecessor letter describes the investigation as ongoing," she said. "Not concluded. Still open. And it describes every civilization as a different version of the same attempt." She looked at him. "I think the conclave might be an attempt at something it doesn't know it's attempting yet. And Earth is, what, in this framework? Company," she said. "That's what the letter said. Not guidance. Not an advantage. Just, someone else in the investigation." Drevolin was quiet for a long moment. "HFY," he said, the phrase that meant from this point forward the navigational marker for a change of heading. He said it in the interspecies navigation language, not in Karoth, which Mara understood as a deliberate choice. Not his language. The shared one. "From this point forward," she said. "Yes." Above them, through the thin autumn cloud, a commercial orbital transport was making its re-entry approach, the faint bright line of a ship coming home. Back at the reception facility, over the course of a full day of formal and informal meetings, the shape of something new was constructed. Not a treaty. Not an integration timeline. A research commission, joint, ongoing with no sunset date and no defined endpoint, whose stated purpose was the continued investigation of the predecessor letters and their implications for every civilization involved. The commission would include Earth but not just it. Drevolin had come with an offer from 7 conclave member civilizations, including, notably, a Karoth delegation that had gone through significant internal restructuring in the previous 30 cycles, to participate as founding members. The Asane had sent a message through diplomatic channels that morning, which Rhea had translated in time for the meeting. They would join. They specifically requested access to the entire letters archive, which was still undergoing decoding. They're the oldest active civilization in the Conclave, Olin said to Mara during a break. They've been flying between stars for over 600 years. And they want to read the homework of the youngest civilization in the room. They've been asking the same question for 600 years, Mara said. Of course they want to compare notes. Olin, overhearing this through Rhea's translation, made the acknowledgement with implication sound again. Velsorin attended the Commission's inaugural session from the Hearth node via transmission, because her position as a survey cartographer didn't qualify her for in-person diplomatic access and because she had a long-standing, firmly held view that her actual work was more useful than her presence at meetings. She watched the inaugural session and then sent Mara a message. It's real, isn't it? Not an agreement. Something else. I've been trying to find the right word for it for 3 days. The closest I have in Varric is a term that translates to something like shared horizon. Not a destination because you can't reach a horizon. Just the act of walking toward the same one. I thought when the Meridian Cradle first detected those fold signatures that the story would be about the discovery. The moment of revelation. That's usually what these stories are about. But the discovery was just the beginning of the question, wasn't it? I'm glad I sent that transmission. I'm glad you sent that message back. Versus. Mara wrote back in the brief space between one meeting and another. So am I. Thank you for knocking on the door. Talk soon. MC. 6 months after Olin stood on the grass outside Geneva and looked at the autumn sky, the predecessor Letters Joint Research Commission released its first collaborative paper. It was 43 pages and had 29 co-authors from 11 different civilizations. It was written in Conclave's administrative language with parallel translations in Earth's 3 primary contact languages. It dealt with a section of the letters that had been previously classified, by Earth's External Relations Department, as meaning-dense and not yet fully processable, a category that had been maintained out of caution and was now being revisited in the light of having, for the first time, cognitive frameworks from 11 other civilizational traditions to bring to the analysis. The paper's title, in Conclave administrative language, translates as On the Nature of the Ongoing, toward a multi-civilizational framework for predecessor intent. Yasakem, in the Hearth Node Archive Division, read it on the day of publication and made another note in the margin of the null 17 Sol file. Reclassification Recommendation. See Commission Paper. 1. Category to be developed. Velsorin was, by the time the paper was published, back in her pale blue sensory chamber aboard the Meridian Cradle, completing the survey of Sector Null 17 that had been extended 3 times by request from the Commission for additional spatial data. She read the paper in her off-cycle hours, pressing her perception tendrils into the interface membrane and mapping the stars while she processed the words. She thought about the fold space residue signatures she had found 6 months ago in the passive sensor data. 4,311 of them, where the Conclave had expected none. The first sign of a civilization that had grown up in the quiet and learned to move through space the way you move through a room in your own house, with the ease of someone who belongs. She had told Mara in one of their conversations that she had almost missed it. The signatures were not where she expected to find them. Mara had said, "That's the thing about questions you haven't asked yet. They're never where you look first." Olin submitted a report to the Karoth military command structure that was classified at the highest level and would not be declassified for 50 years. In it, he documented his full assessment of Earth and his recommendations going forward. The final paragraph read, "The strategic concern that motivated this assessment, that Earth's development trajectory could not be accommodated within conclave frameworks, was correct. The conclusion drawn from that concern, that the appropriate response was constraint or neutralization, was wrong. The correct response to a civilization that exceeds your framework is to expand it. Such an action is not weakness. This is the acknowledgement that frameworks are tools, not laws. The conclave was built as a tool. Like all tools, it is appropriate to ask what it is for and to adjust its design when what it's for becomes clearer. Earth is not a threat. Earth is a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we bring to the eye. I recommend continued engagement. I recommend philosophical courage. I recommend that we stop being afraid of the question and start being interested in the answer. From this point forward." Mara Chen's last entry in the External Relations Department's internal log for that first year of contact read, "Summary of Year 1. We made contact. It was complicated. It remains complicated. We shared something we had been holding carefully for 30 years, and the sharing changed the shape of the conversation in a way I couldn't have planned. We were attacked. No one died. The attack revealed something important about the nature of fear and the forms it takes in the political architecture of civilizations that have been around long enough to have a great deal to lose. We made a friend we didn't expect. A military commander from a civilization whose entire developmental history oriented them toward caution about exactly what we are. He stood on the grass outside Geneva and looked at the sky and asked the right question. We found out that the predecessors didn't give us a gift in the conventional sense. They gave us company. Something to not be alone with while we keep asking. The investigation continues. What I know now that I didn't know a year ago, the warships didn't jump into the fray because we were weak. They came because we were visible. Because we had grown large enough and real enough that our existence demanded engagement, demanded decision, and demanded the kind of reckoning that civilizations put off for as long as they can, because reckoning is hard and uncertainty is uncomfortable, and it is always easier to keep a thing classified than to look at it. We were the open question in the Conclave's archives for 240 years. We are still open to the question. But now at least the question is being asked out loud. Mara Chin, Director of External Relations, Unified Earth Governance, Year 1 of Active Contact. Outside the reception facility in Geneva, the autumn had become winter, and the winter was becoming spring. The grass outside was growing again, slowly, in the way of things that have deep roots, the kind of growth that is not fast but is, in the end, permanent. The meridian cradle moved through the outer quiet, mapping stars that had been there for 5 billion years and would be there for 5 billion more, patient as mathematics. The hearth node turned in its binary orbit, arguing and deliberating and slowly, gradually, asking different questions than it had asked before. And on the blue world, the investigation continued, as it had always continued, as the predecessors had hoped it would, without conclusion, without endpoint, without the comfort of an answer that closed the question. Just the door open. Just the horizon shared. Just the ongoing, ordinary, extraordinary act of asking together. Indeed.